the 10th anniversary of September 11th, and it's on a lot of people's minds. Before I was here, Scott and I were at a memorial ceremony in New Jersey, which was addressed by the two senators, Lautenberg and Menendez, and Governor Christie. And, you know, you have a sense that most of the population, frankly, isn't all that settled about what occurred, largely because everyone knows that the truth has not been told. That somehow these planes hit the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, you know, crashed in Pennsylvania, a lot of people died. We didn't get any straight answers, and the next thing you know, we're in a war with Iraq, which not even Bush pretended had anything to do with 9/11. So something really screwy went on, and most people do have a sense of that. And what I want to address, and we can take more questions on the details of 9/11, but is really, as I said, why did it fail to destroy the United States? Because that was the intent of 9/11, and it was not Osama bin Laden. It wasn't some guy having kidney failure sitting in a cave running an operation to destroy the United States. As Alan referenced, British Aerospace had a major role. The Saudis were involved. I mean, if you think about who the hijackers were, they all came from Saudi Arabia, 17 of the 19. Apparently the Israeli Mossad at least knew about it. So there's a lot, but I want to go back to what LaRouche did, because you remember, and this was one of his amazing forecasts, remember the election of 2000, and it was Gore and Bush. And LaRouche said the most likely outcome of this election would be that nobody would win. And I was a political organizer at the time, and I thought, now that is really, how am I going to explain that to someone? He's saying we're going to have a presidential election and no one is going to win. That's never happened. How do you know? And then sure enough, you have the election and there's no winner. And remember, it dragged on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And we had the Florida recount and the floating chads and the whatever. I mean, it was really bizarre. And I want to just be very clear, Al Gore was no good either, so let's not say the country would have been better off with this guy. It was the beginning of a certain kind of destruction. And remember, in the late 90s, you had the collapse of the Asian tigers, the bubble, Malaysia, Indonesia, their economies were crashing. It was the beginning of the blowout of the Western system. Because when communism failed in 1989, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, LaRouche and others who were smart, but LaRouche in particular, said, look, this is not a victory for the free trade system. Unless you move with an FDR-style approach where the West shares its technology with the East and you use it to create a renaissance, what will happen is this free trade system of money making money, of no production, no scientific progress, that's going to crash just as surely as the Soviet Union crashed. So you had all this uproar over who was going to be president. Then I guess it was decided that Bush was president. And then what happened was they started having hearings. And John Ashcroft came up as a nominee for Attorney General. And LaRouche gave a webcast in January of 2001. And he said, if John Ashcroft becomes Attorney General, knowing his proclivities for dictatorship, for fascism, it means that the Bush administration is going to be looking for a Reichstag fire event, an event that can be used to go for a dictatorship. So LaRouche said that in January of 2001. Then in August of 2001, when there were moves of countries to go to a gold standard, and there was going to, remember the World Trade conference in Seattle, and they had all those kind of weird agent provocateurs with the ski masks and all of this kind of nasty, violent stuff. LaRouche put out a warning that there was likely to be a terror attack on the United States. So on the morning of September 11th, I, my husband, people who were organizers then, I was in Washington, D.C. at the time, at an intersection. Here we are handing out leaflets warning of a terror attack on the United States. And then people start driving by and say, have you heard the news? Have you heard what happened? And it was terrifying, and it was terrifying as it was here. It was terrifying to be in DC because everyone thought the White House was going to be a target. All the roads were shut down, and I mean, it's just a day that no one is going to forget. And the thing that really was unnerving was LaRouche was so on. And it turned out that morning, just as a coincidence, he was doing a radio show, Jack Stockwell, out in Utah, just as the towers were hit. And LaRouche said, I hope no one tries to blame this on Osama bin Laden. And then he also said that Bush better contact Putin, or what was it, Medvedev, who was Putin. He better contact the head of Russia right now because we could have a real collision immediately. Now, happily, there was the discussion between the US and Russia, so it didn't escalate in that way. But again, here he was on the radio at the moment, the only coherent leadership that the United States had. But see, what is the intent of this sort of thing? What was the intent of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, of Garfield, McKinley, of Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, the Warren Commission? Because the United States has a particular identity which is absolutely crucial for civilization. And now we can go to the first. What I wanted to look at, this is from Adam Smith. How many people have heard that Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, had something to do with the founding of the United States? They always talk about it, the wealth of nations. Yeah, that's what they say. Well, listen to this. This is from his theory of moral sentiments. To man is allotted a much humbler department. Nature has directed us to the greater part of these by original and immediate instincts, hunger, thirst, the passion which unites the two sexes, the love of pleasure and the dread of pain, prompt us to apply those means for their own sakes, and without any consideration of the tendency to those beneficent ends which the great director of nature intended to produce by them. Now, what is the difference between this and an animal? A beast? Isn't that what, I have a dog. My dog is highly motivated. Food, affection, fear, that's how my dog acts. That is not appropriate behavior for a human being. That is not how human beings act. This is anti-human. This is a denial of the distinction between human beings and animals. But it is the view that was imposed very much on the baby boomer generation, which were young adults going through all these assassinations in the Vietnam War. And everyone's run up against it, where people say things like, you can't change anything. You should really take care of yourself. Don't do that for that other person because they'll never appreciate it and you're just going to get in trouble. Right? All of the things that actually make us human, which is that you don't act from the standpoint of your physical pleasure and pain, but you act from the standpoint of something greater, which is the long-term survival of mankind, which is from whence we get our immortality. It's not that each one of us is going to live forever, but you would hope that you contribute something that future generations live better than we do. That's what it means to be human. And I can assure you that this is not on my dog's mind. That is not how he operates. Now, look at the American Declaration of Independence from that standpoint. Everyone knows this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that is fascinating because in the Massachusetts Constitution and elsewhere, and also later in the Confederate Constitution, they don't talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's life, liberty, property. Property, okay? What's the pursuit of happiness? How do you measure that? And there's a difference between happiness and pleasure. For example, chocolate chip cookies. I mean, you might find pleasure in that. It's sensuous, but that's not really the source of what you would call happiness. Although it can be, no. Right. But you think about things where people say that they're actually happy, like think about these couples that you see sometimes on the street who are holding hands and they're each about 105 years old. And you think about a marriage that's been 50, 60, 70 years, that's happiness. And you can be sure that it wasn't all pleasure. It wasn't all easy. You think about landing on the moon, right? People were inspired, but people died for us to get there. There were launches where people just burned up on the launch pad. But nonetheless, there was a happiness of mankind, of bridging a frontier. This is American. This is in our Declaration of Independence. And here's another question. With what sense organ do you perceive happiness? Can you hold it? Does it have a smell?
The mind.
The mind, exactly. Exactly, it's the mind. And the mind is not the same thing as the brain, right? So it's beyond sense perception as people think of. And LaRouche keeps talking about this, the evil of our culture where everything is, it has to be explained in terms of sense perception. That's one of the problems, for example, of modern science, but also all the stuff that you get around 9/11, where everyone wants the mechanical explanation. They want to know, if the planes hit the World Trade Center, did that really cause them to collapse, or was it a demolition? Or was it, and how do you prove? Well, okay, fine. Someone who knows these things might be interested, but that's not the point. The point was the spiritual attack on the identity of the United States. Who wanted to destroy the United States, and why have we not quite been destroyed? And how do we defeat that evil intent? That's the issue. So the other question, which is really fascinating, is the question of all men being created equal. Now that definitely is not obvious to your senses. I mean, no two people are alike, and it's actually astounding with 6.7 billion people on the planet that, except for identical twins who might seem somewhat similar, I mean, other than that, people don't even seem remotely similar. I mean, you don't have confusion recognizing your friends or your neighbors, right? So people are actually quite unique, and there's over 6.7 billion of us. So the idea that every person is created equal is, again, one of these ideas. It's in the mind. It's in another domain. It's not in the sense perception. And this is really important because this is the identity of the United States. And we'll go through, I wanted to take a number of cases in history where you really get a sense of just how powerful this is. And you should know, we have been at war with the British Empire since the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1600s, the War of 1812, the so-called Civil War, which was the War of the Rebellion, where had we not turned the tide at Gettysburg, the British were going to recognize the Confederacy as a nation, and they were going to come to the aid of the South. And the Russians, interestingly, actually came to the aid of Abraham Lincoln. Tsar Alexander II threatened the British. They said, if you enter the war on the side of the Confederacy, Russia's going to enter the war on the side of the Union Army. And they sent fleets. They sent a fleet to San Francisco, and they sent a fleet to New York. And they said, we'll fight in the United States, and we'll fight you in Europe, too. It's interesting. Very important ally at that time. Now, look at Lincoln thinking of this identity, how the country was torn apart. And this is his second inaugural address. And the war was still going on because the war lasted for 5 years. So it had not ended. I'm just going to go to the second part. It's a short speech. Everyone should just read it next. And it ends. People have probably heard this many times. Fondly do we hope, this is on the wall at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. Fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still must it be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Okay, that embodies the United States because it's a noble conception of the dignity of what it means to be human. He doesn't say, when this war is over, we're going to round up all those Confederate soldiers, we're going to pull out their fingernails, and we're going to torture them. It would be insane. And you have this actually from the time of George Washington, because the Hessians, the mercenaries from Germany used by the British to fight us, were absolutely brutal, and they did horrific things, and they tortured our soldiers. And Washington said, we are never going to do that. We are never going to stoop to that level of degradation. And because people recognized, and there's story upon story of this in many, many different wars, that Americans did not conduct themselves in the same way as the people that we were fighting. That many, many people, like in World War II, all these German prisoners of war stayed here. They became Americans. They said this is a superior culture. Because you have, one guy wrote, he said, I got to my prison and they gave me a toothbrush. You know, what did they do to the Americans? And people may know some of these people. We had a good supporter who had horrible, they starved him in the German war camps. He was starved, just like a concentration camp. They would starve the troops, march them all over the place, and he had horrible illnesses ever since his captivity. But the prisoners that we captured were treated in a certain way, and many of them wanted to become American citizens after the war. So this, again, you see, and it was, by the way, very fascinating because the military was absolutely crucial in keeping the nation together after the Civil War. Jeff Davis and others wanted the Ku Klux Klan. They wanted to run guerrilla warfare. and just irregular war, which would have ripped the country up for decades. And the generals on both sides comported themselves with a certain standard of dignity, which really came from Lincoln, came from the top. And it was ended, and we did not have guerrilla warfare forever, thank God. Now, one other example, which I really thought was fascinating, is Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who was the general. He was just a lieutenant colonel at Gettysburg. He was made famous because of what he did at Little Round Top. But he's an amazing person. He was a teacher of modern languages and a theologian, and he formed singing schools in Maine. He organized choirs, and I don't know how many languages he spoke, a lot. Anyway, so Abraham Lincoln chose him once General Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Chamberlain was the one chosen to receive the Confederate soldiers. And this is, in his own words, what he writes about it, which is quite profound. He said, "The momentous meaning of this occasion impressed me deeply. I resolved to mark it by some token of recognition, which could be no other than a salute of arms. Well aware of the responsibility assumed and the criticisms as that would follow, as the sequel proved, nothing of that kind could move me in the least." In other words, he was prepared to salute the Confederate troops as they surrendered. That act could be defended if needful by the suggestion that such a salute was not the cause for which the flag of the Confederacy stood, but to its going down before the flag of the Union. My main reason, however, was one for which I sought no authority nor asked forgiveness. Before us, in proud humiliation, stood the embodiment of manhood, men whom neither toils and sufferings, nor the fact of death, nor disaster, nor hopelessness could bend from their resolve. Standing before us now, thin, worn, and famished, but erect, and with eyes looking level into ours, waking memories that bound us together as no other bond. Was not such manhood to be welcomed back into the Union, so tested and assured? Isn't that something? And so they did, and Chamberlain caught hell for doing this. And he describes here later how the Confederate general, who was the first brigade to come and surrender, when they did the salute, that he was so moved, he did this totally incredible, I couldn't even imagine it on his horse, some incredible, completely eloquent salute back to the Union soldiers. So you can see how important it was, and you can think of Lincoln's thinking and why he would choose this person to receive the surrender of the Confederate soldiers, with the idea that we were going to pull our nation together and build, and you begin to get an insight as to why Lincoln was assassinated by the British. And the people involved in it went over to London, like Judah Benjamin, who was head of intelligence for the Confederates, and he was made a member of the Queen's Privy Council. So again, but very important. Then, later, do we have a map? Is that what's up? Yeah. World War II. So what happened to Europe? You had a global financial collapse and depression. You had the collapse of the US stock market here in 1929. And what did you have? You had fascism taking over, right? You had Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy. You had Vichy, France, which they can claim was invaded, but they orchestrated the invasion. You had Franco in Spain. The whole place went fascist. But we didn't. We elected Franklin Roosevelt, who was explicitly not fascist. And I wanted, did you get the recording?
Yep.
Yeah, you hear again this question of the American identity in the speech that he gave.
President Hoover, Mr. Chief Justice, my friends, This is a day of national consecration. And I am certain that on this day, my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency, I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people impels. This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly. Nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. In every dark hour of our national life, a leadership of frankness and of vigor has met with that understanding and support of the people themselves, which is essential to victory. And I am convinced that you will again give that support to leadership in these critical days.
Okay, so again, it's American. It's American, our identity. So, what happened after September 11th is worth reflecting on, because there has been, I mean, how could someone like Obama get into the presidency? And how could people tolerate each attack that he makes against the American people and our Constitution and keep saying he needs more time, he's just being manipulated, he doesn't really want to do it? Well, because what you had over these 10 years is a series then of attacks using this. The first one I mentioned earlier, that somehow we decide that we have to launch a war against Iraq, which did not attack us and which was not threatening to attack us, and really was not this Iraq and the United States, they're not a threat to the United States. But people went along with it. And then I think one of the crucial turning points in terms of Americans' identity was when those photographs came out from Abu Ghraib. Because I actually thought that people would like go to Washington and say, forget it, don't do this. I mean, I don't know how many people here have read the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, but in it he describes, he had a mistress who really just didn't like slavery, and she taught him how to read, and she then got in trouble for teaching him how to read, because obviously if you can read, you develop your mind and you're not fit to be a slave. So once they came down really hard on her for teaching him how to read, she became one of the nastiest, most vicious, most miserable mistresses ever. And he said that he became convinced that the effects of slavery were much more pernicious to the slave holders. He said people can be abused and recover from it. I mean, think about Jerry Adams, the Sinn Féin. I mean, he was tortured. He is a very dignified person, but the person who perpetrates the torture on another human being is the person who is destroyed. So you have a policy of telling our young soldiers to subject people who are already captured under our control to total degradation and humiliation. And this is supposed to provide intelligence. If I thought I was going to drown, I would probably say anything. I don't think you'd get like very accurate, and in fact it's true. In fact,
they say it doesn't work.
No, it doesn't work. So there was no reason except destruction of our soldiers. This did more damage to our soldiers than to the people that we tortured. And the American people, by tolerating it, by spitting on George Washington and other top generals who insisted that we would never stoop to conduct ourselves in this fashion, Americans took a gigantic moral step backwards by allowing this. And by the way, for people who don't know, Obama absolutely, totally supports the torture policy. And not only that, under Obama, it has become officially legal to assassinate an American overseas. This was an unofficial policy before. Now it is an official legal policy. So this was part, again, of the continuing attack against the American people. So then what? Once we were prepared to go along with that, well, where is value? Is it in being human, or is it in money? Well, think about what happened with the bailout, and see, even then, remember the first vote on the bailout in September of 2007? And so many people called and emailed to Congress and said, don't do this, don't do this. This is Bush was in power, Paulson was the Federal Reserve Treasury Secretary, another Goldman Sachs guy. Anyway, and it didn't happen. Remember, it was defeated, the first vote. And then what happened? Paulson threatened that if you don't do this bailout, everything's going to crash. We're going to have to bring in the troops. There's going to be chaos. We're going to have martial law. So the Congress went along with it. And now you have people who say, many people, wasn't it necessary? So the thing that the overwhelming majority of Americans opposed in 2007, now many people say, well, wasn't it necessary? I mean, what if the stock market crashed? Where would we be? I don't know, we might still have another 30,000 police officers employed. I mean, you know, we might actually have the Army Corps of Engineers still functioning. But so there was this, we've been getting worse. Now, it's in this context that LaRouche, and last November, really, where you got to a turning point, because you had, people were getting really fed up with Obama. They realized that he wasn't the change from Bush that they were hoping for. And so on November 2nd, you had this vote where people went out and they just voted for anything just to not have Obama. And they voted for a lot of these really crazy people like Rand Paul, who think that we shouldn't even have government at all. We should just not have a government because it's a waste of money. Now, why people who think we shouldn't have a government run for office, I'm not sure of. It seems to be a little contradictory, but at any rate, so what happened, LaRouche said, because we were calling people back after the election, like 2 weeks, and they realized, oh my God, now Obama and Boehner are working together and you have a bipartisan attack on the middle class. They're going to get rid of Social Security, Medicare. There's no discussion of building anything. The space program is being taken. You realize we're taking down the space program. We have people up there that we can't get back.
Right.
I mean, it's insane. So anyway, LaRouche, we were calling people back and they said, I'm having a nervous breakdown. I'm out of politics. I don't want to be involved. I voted for Obama because I didn't like Bush, and then Obama was rotten, and then I thought I voted against Obama, and I got these rotten people, so just forget it. I don't want to be involved. And he said, no, what we have to do is provide actual leadership. And it was shortly after that LaRouche proposed, given his age, he turned 89 2 days ago, that he would not run for president, but that 6 of us, and we will be expanding the slate, but that 6 of us would run for Congress around the country, not about sucking up to somebody in November of 2012 and winning an election, but to use our candidacies to function as the actual Congress should function. And since that was launched, as people know, we did get Marcy Kaptur. She did introduce 1489. We do have a Glass-Steagall Act in the Congress that can be mobilized for. And now what's happening, because of all of these extreme weather conditions, the engineers, and you can go to the next slide, that we were in touch with about the North American Water and Power Alliance, oh yeah, I forgot that, that's okay, are now back very, very active. And this is just a sort of schematic of Nawapa, where there's a lot more to it, but basically we have enormous rainfall up in this area, Alaska, northern Canada, and it hits the mountains and it just goes out here, it goes into the Arctic Sea. It's fresh water, which is not used for anything, it just is lost. So what we're talking about is diverting 20% of it, bringing it down into the Rocky Mountain Trench. And this was designed in the 60s when people were still optimistic and they thought we should go to the moon and do things like that. The Parsons group, who designed the Hoover Dam, designed this. The Rocky Mountain Trench, and then you have different routes. There's already a partial canal system in Canada, which would be more filled out and connected, so you bring water into the Great Lakes, which is urgently needed. They're getting very polluted. There's not enough fresh water flowing through. Water down this way, and then here, the West Coast, the Great American Desert, all the way down the Colorado River, which similarly is getting very dense with just chemicals and so on. You need this here. So you're talking about, and the hub of this in the United States, which is really fun, is in Idaho, which is a very sparsely populated place, a lot like Nevada, you know, where Lake Mead is now. That was the middle of nowhere. So here you have the Sawtooth Mountains, which is the highest point of this project, 5,200 feet above sea level. And Idaho has very few people living in it. So in order to actually build this, we're talking about, I think, 50 major tunnels and pumps and lifts in Idaho. You're going to have to take a lot of the workforce from here. We're going to have to take a lot of older people who are skilled out of retirement. They're going to have to train a lot of younger people. And the younger people are going to be inspired because they're going to be doing something which was considered impossible before. Also, we're going to have all these veterans. And the veterans have some skills and some discipline, so that you have a combination to put together. This would require, just the water end of it is about 4 million jobs. The nuclear power that we're going to have to build to pump the water up these lifts is about another 1.5 million jobs related to that. And then you're talking about, one estimate was it's going to take 5 years just to build the railroads from here across the country. People know Bill Roberts, our guy running in Michigan, is talking to all these machinists. It's fascinating. I had no idea that the reason you have all these machinists in this Great Lakes region is because of the types of iron and steel, and there are zillions of different types of steel depending on what you're using it for. So this was an area very rich in these raw materials, which is why it's an extremely important part of the country. This was the famous arsenal of democracy. Remember, in World War II, all the auto plants started pumping out airplanes, tanks. You know, it's very versatile. So this is something that's going to pull the entire United States into a gigantic mission with massive employment, and we're going to be forced to upgrade the level of thinking of our whole population, particularly the younger people. And given that we have the insanity of total wipeout floods over here and Texas being burned up, it is becoming clear to people that water management is actually, yes, necessary and a human approach that we should do. So now we don't have, thanks to the intergalactic forces run by God, We don't have such a big job convincing people why this is necessary anymore. Next. Then, once you're doing all this development in Alaska, it begs the question of the Bering Strait, which is only about 40 to 60 miles across. The Russians have already decided that they're going to go ahead even though we haven't agreed. And I'll tell you, I would be really embarrassed if a Russian high-speed train pops up in Alaska and we don't have any railroads there. But they are planning to build this. And this would be an incredibly exciting joint project, which is Siberia. Siberia is the richest part of the whole planet in raw materials. And we haven't, you can go to the next one. We haven't figured out how to get there. Oh, wow.
You know what this is?
It's permafrost.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can tell you what the colors mean. I mean, this is why no one's ever done this, because it's just incredibly difficult. This is like going to the moon. So these dark things are continuous permafrost, more than 500 meters thick. And then this shade of purple here, continuous permafrost, which is only 300 meters thick. Okay. Then the light blue is permafrost, which is only 100 to 300 meters thick. And then this is where you get a little bit of a thaw, where you have less than 100 meters of permafrost. Okay, and then sporadic frost. So it's a rough place. It is a rough place. Very extreme conditions. But I'll tell you, if human beings figure out how to live in places like this and build railroads, one of the things that we've been looking into, and we've been interviewing the top guy on evacuated tube high-speed rail. So you have a rail, a magnetically levitated rail, which people know how that works, right? The magnets are against each other, so you don't get friction. It's very little friction, no wheels. And these trains already go like, 220 miles an hour is the average speed if you don't really push it. But when you put a maglev train in a vacuum tube, it goes 1,000 miles an hour. And you want a place that is flat. So either you're going to build a tunnel underground, or Siberia is a great place for this because it's very flat. And then you wouldn't have to go 500 meters under the permafrost to get it across it. So these are the technologies that are being discussed. Remember in the 60s, and I wasn't much around then, and certainly not very old, but I definitely have a sense that our nation, people used to really think like this. What are we going to be doing 25 years from now? What are we going to be doing 50 years from now? Are our children going to be able to live on Mars in a century, our great-grandchildren? I mean, people used to think about things like that. What are we going to discover about medicine from space flight? Like this whole question of what happens to the astronauts, why do their bones, seem to decay when they're in outer space, and people thought it was because they weren't because there was no gravity. So then they had them on all these, weightlifting machines, and they came back and their bones were still falling apart. They still had osteoporosis. And then what they discovered was it comes from our electromagnetic field. That the thing that builds your bone structure is part of the kind of radiation that we're subjected to on Earth. And when you're in space, you don't get it. And they're discovering that you can get people to heal much more quickly. If someone has a severe fracture, that you get this electromagnetic field around the fracture and the bone heals much more quickly than it would otherwise. Now, we would have never figured this out had we not had human beings in space. Okay, but under Obama, we're eliminating. That's not necessary. Why should we go back to the moon? We already went there. Right? So anyway, this, you can see, and you can see that doing this is going to raise the question of how come we're not in outer space. I mean, if we could figure out how to civilize Siberia, why couldn't we colonize Mars? Really? And that's the mission of human beings. And I'll tell you, this is why this identity, which is unique to the United States, because think about what Americans did. We were the first republic ever to defeat the British Empire. And that was a big deal, and people were scared. No one even dared to, no head of state dared to visit us for an entire century. They were scared to be seen with us because we had dared to stand up to the biggest guy on the planet, the British Empire, and beat them. Okay, beat them. So we defeated the British Empire. Then what did we do? The Transcontinental Railroad. We built the first Transcontinental Railroad. Think of the canal systems. Think about, I understand one of the things when a lot of foreigners did visit us finally, and when the Emperor of Brazil, who was the first foreign head of state to come here, was the Emperor of Brazil at the Philadelphia, the Centennial Exposition. And apparently, besides all of the amazing industrial technology and trains and you know, things that we were building, one of the things that people were blown away by is that American workers had indoor plumbing. That is, it wasn't just a thing for the royalty. I mean, people were blown away. Again, think about what's in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, right? The identity of our nation. We were the first to land on the moon. Okay, so this is our identity. That's, oh yeah, that's a nice picture of Siberia. Okay, that must be the warm part. That's the warm part. So that, because of that profound identity, we have not yet been destroyed. But now it's close, because Europe is disintegrating, we are disintegrating, and the question really is one of leadership. And we can't simply rely on the idea. Some people, like the ones LaRouche was making fun of, who said, when the time is right, I'll act. Right? When everything blows out, I just know they're going to pass Glass-Steagall. Well, we cannot, a good commander in a war would never conduct a war that way. So we cannot assume that. We have to make it happen. So that's what I would just like to say in closing, given that it is the 10th anniversary of September 11th, that everyone here should commit him and herself to perpetually defeating every last vestige of empire on the planet. That's it. Thank you. So I guess we can take questions. I also have an announcement, which people should be happy to hear, which is that Yvette Clark has now signed on to